If you drive a Jeep JK, you know the fear. You hit a slight bump at highway speeds, and suddenly the entire front end feels like it's trying to rip itself apart. This is death wobble. It is a violent, self-sustaining lateral harmonic resonance occurring across the solid front axle. Once it starts, the physics of the suspension feed the vibration, amplifying the energy. You cannot power through it, and you cannot steer out of it. The only way to break this oscillation is to bring the vehicle to a complete stop. Many owners react by bolting on a heavy-duty steering stabilizer, hoping a massive shock absorber will tame the front end. A steering stabilizer only masks the vibration, acting as a temporary bandage, while the underlying hardware continues to tear itself to pieces out of sight. Every violent oscillation traces back to physical slack in the system, mechanical failure that must be diagnosed, isolated, and clamped down. This is the naked architecture of the Dana 30 and 44 front axle assembly. Understanding these constraints is the first step to fixing the problem. A single piece of steel keeps the axle centered, the track bar. Massive lateral forces push against it. Failure begins when a fraction of a millimeter of slack develops at its mounts. Hitting a bump shifts the joint, rapidly pulling the axle back, triggering resonance. Locating and eliminating this specific micro-movement in the track bar system is the absolute core requirement for stopping the shake. The Jeep JK platform shipped from the factory with a specific hardware vulnerability that guarantees eventual suspension slack. Chrysler assembled track bars using 14mm bolts, but inserted them into 9/16" bracket holes. This dimensional mismatch creates a visible gap. Worse, these factory bolts are fully threaded, meaning sharp, jagged threads sit directly against the mounting brackets and smooth metal sleeve. Under heavy suspension load, that gap allows the bolt to vibrate. Those sharp steel threads act like a metal file against the brackets inside. Over thousands of miles, this filing action destroys the perfectly round factory hole, hollowing it out into a large, sloppy oval. That ovalization provides the exact millimeter of slack required for harmonic resonance to take over the entire front end. While hardware failure provides the movement, altered suspension geometry often provides the dynamic trigger. Look at a healthy, factory-spec Jeep. Drawing lines through the pivot points of the drag link and track bar reveals a strict geometric relationship. These two bars must remain perfectly parallel from frame to axle at all times, regardless of suspension compression. A common error when installing a lift kit is altering one bar's angle without correcting the other. The parallel lines break and travel arcs dramatically intersect. This creates bump steer. Compressing the suspension forces the steering knuckle to violently yank to the side. If your suspension geometry isn't parallel, bump steer will continuously inject massive lateral force into the system, initiating the death wobble resonance. To locate the exact slack causing this resonance, you need to perform the dry steering test. It is the undisputed diagnostic protocol for isolating front-end failure points. The critical physical prerequisite for this test is gravity. The vehicle's full weight must remain perfectly flat on the ground to maintain tire resistance against the pavement. Have an operator inside the cab start the engine and rapidly, forcefully cycle the steering wheel back and forth between 10 and 2 o'clock. While the steering cycles, you crawl underneath the front bumper and physically place your hand directly over the track bar joints at both the frame and the axle. You are feeling for isolation. Pay close attention to any independent shifting, popping or sliding between the bolt head, the internal bushing sleeve, and the metal bracket. The pass-fail condition is absolute. If the joint does not move as a single, perfectly locked unit before the chassis itself shifts, that joint has failed. Once the track bar is cleared, the diagnostic protocol moves outward to the steering linkage, specifically focusing on the tie rod and drag link ends. You test these joints by taking a large pair of channel lock pliers, squeezing the joints directly, and checking for internal play. It is critical to understand the difference in movement here. Normal rotational twist along the axis of the joint is expected. Vertical up and down popping within the joint is fatal. Next, you evaluate the lower ball joints. Unlike the dry steering test, this requires jacking the front axle slightly off the ground to relieve the vehicle's weight from the tires. Slide a long pry bar completely under the front tire and leverage it upward. Watch closely for any vertical deflection inside the ball joint knuckle as you lift. The tolerance limit here is incredibly strict. Vertical deflection in these ball joints should absolutely not exceed 1 to 2 millimeters. Aggressively isolating and replacing these secondary worn joints prevents minor road shimmies from compounding into full-scale harmonic resonance. If your dry steering test revealed an ovalized track bar bracket on either the axle or the frame, you must rebuild that mount's structural integrity. Warning tone. Simply inserting a larger bolt and cranking it down into a damaged ovalized hole will inevitably fail again as the forces return. The permanent repair requires welding heavy quarter-inch steel plates or thick washers with exact 9/16" holes directly over the factory mounts to restore perfectly round structural steel. Immediately discard the 14mm factory bolts. Replace them with 9/16" fine thread grade 8 bolts that perfectly match the inner diameter of your new floats and bushings. It is critical that you utilize shouldered bolts. The smooth, unthreaded shoulder makes full, flush contact with the metal bushing sleeve, completely eliminating the filing effect that destroyed the factory bracket. This specific combination of structural steel welding and precision-fitted shouldered hardware permanently removes the micro-slack that enables death wobble. Even with perfect geometry and upgraded steel, there is one final mistake commonly made by DIY installers and lazy alignment shops. Torquing your control arms or track bar bolts while the Jeep's axle is hanging freely on a lift guarantees premature failure. Tightening the hardware while in the air preloads and pinches the rubber bushings at an unnatural droop angle. The moment the vehicle is lowered to the ground, those bushings bind up and immediately begin tearing. This is the golden rule of solid axles. The vehicle must have its full weight resting flat on the ground at actual ride height before a torque wrench ever touches the bolts. For the front track bar hardware, lock it down to the uncompromising torque specification of exactly 125 foot-pounds. The fix requires an ongoing maintenance schedule to prevent regression. Hardware must be retorqued after the first 50 miles, after any heavy off-roading, and at every scheduled oil change. Eradicating death wobble requires strict, lifelong adherence to perfect geometry, zero-tolerance hardware, and a disciplined maintenance schedule.